like that campfire.
Okay, sweets.
We were born for greater things. We were born to chase your dreams. Come, my Lord, awaken holy fire. We are turning from our sin. We are praying once again.
Hey guys, let's sing a campfire song.
Oh, hey, how about this one? Yo, this is a story all about how my life got turned upside down. And I'd like to take a second.
No! We want a campfire story!
All right, that's fine.
Burn like a star, light a fire in our hearts.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. It's good to see everyone here this morning. We're in the third week, I think. I missed last week, so it's kind of hard for me to keep up. On Father's Day, I went to worship with my son, who plays in the band at a church in College Station. And it was good, but I miss being here and I miss seeing y'all. Anyway, I think it's our third week in our series, Campfire Stories. And there's hundreds of stories in the Bible that qualify as campfire stories. I mean, some of them are really well known. There's stories in there that a lot of us could just tell by heart. We've heard them that many times. For instance, a couple weeks ago, Juan talked about the story of Noah and his ark. And while we may not have known all the points that Pastor Juan made during that message, a lot of us could recite the story of Noah and the ark, about the animals and the rain and the ark and the rainbows and all that by heart, because we've heard it since we were children. Pastor Sarah teaches that in children's school here now. So some of those stories we know really well. Others, they're kind of like the one I told a couple of years ago about Balaam's donkey, the talking donkey. A lot of people don't know those. And today's story is another one that not everyone will know. It's not one of the better known ones. But it is really short and easy to remember, so after this, you'll probably be able to retell it anytime you want. May not want, but if you do, you'll be able. It's got an easy point, a clear point, and we'll just get into the story and we'll tell it, see where it goes, and then I'll try to bring some focus on the points. So the story I'm talking about today is written about in two of the Gospels, Mark and Luke. I'm going to use Mark's version today because, frankly, Luke gets all the play, and Mark needs a little more promotion. So I'm going to use Mark today. And it's a story Jesus tells while watching the people giving their offerings at the temple. Now, it's a good time to point out that one of the reasons we don't pass the plate around here during worship is because we don't think anybody needs to see whether you're giving or not or how much. We don't know who gives what, and it's not important. But that's our culture. I mean, that's why we do it that way. But in Jesus' time, apparently the culture was a little different. So Jesus was watching, and this is the story that Mark writes about from Mark 12, verses 41 to 44. Jesus sat down near the collection box in the temple and watched as the crowds dropped in their money. Many rich people put in large amounts. Then a poor widow came and dropped in 2 small coins. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I tell you the truth. Let me take a minute right here. When Jesus says, I tell you the truth, that really means I'm about to tell you something important. Listen up. He uses that phrase a lot throughout the Gospels. And it really means, this is important. You guys need to hear this. So he says, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has given more than all the others who are making contributions. For they gave a tiny part of their surplus. But she, poor as she is, has given everything she had to live on. So see, it's a simple story. Jesus is watching the people give in the temple, and he sees people who have more giving large gifts. And then a widow who has really nothing puts in her 2 small coins. Those 2 small coins in today's money, less than a penny. Less than a penny. But since everything is a teachable moment to Jesus, he calls the disciples and says, not only listen to this, but listen carefully. This is important. her gift is more than any of the others because she had less to give, and she gave it all because she wanted to. She was so thankful to God that she gave it all. See, Jesus doesn't see things the way we do. As citizens of the world, we tend to see financial things in terms of numbers. And the numbers have changed. When I was a kid, $1 million was a large amount. We measured our national debt in millions of dollars. 20 years ago, that number became billions. And today it takes $1 trillion to really get our attention. In money today, size matters, but not to God, not to Jesus. So you notice the only gift he mentioned, pointed out in the story, was the widow. He didn't talk about any of the larger gifts that went, and they may have made more noise when they went in the plate, but the widow's gift was heard in heaven. And that's what got Jesus' attention. See, God doesn't care about the amount of our gifts. He cares about the amount of joy in our giving. Let me say that again, because that's important. Jesus doesn't care about the size or the amount of our gifts. He cares about the amount of joy in our giving. Big gifts or small, they're all equally important to God when they are the product of our love for Him and our gratitude for all He has done and is doing for us. See, it's the size of our hearts, not the size of our gifts that matters to God. He knows our hearts, and He knows our gifts. Only He does. Neither Juan or I know what anybody gives here. We don't need to. None of our business. But God does, and God knows our hearts. He doesn't care about the size of our gifts either. He cares about our hearts. All we care about, the leadership here, I say we, the leadership at Area 316, we care that we're using the resources God has given us in the best way we can for everyone who comes here to find and grow and thrive in their relationship with Jesus Christ. That's what we care about. Being good stewards of whatever resources we're given. We care that your life is better because of something you heard or saw here, or maybe someone you met that you talked with, that prayed with you, or that showed you through the way they lived their life a better way. That's what we care about. We can't know your hearts, but God does. And as I said, He values your joy more than your gifts. In today's story, Jesus also calls our attention to the proportion of the various gifts. Notice He said the gifts of the wealthy who had lots to give. The wealthy may be given more, but they have more. They have a lot left over. Here's what Paul said in his second letter to Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 8, verses 11 to 12. Give in proportion to what you have. Whatever you give is acceptable when you give it eagerly, and give according to what you have, not what you don't have. That's pretty plain. That's pretty clear. The widow gave everything she had in the world. She was making a sacrifice to give it all. The ones giving the big gifts were making no sacrifice. That's what God noticed and values then. He still does today. See, God wants our giving to be powered by our faith in Him. The widow in the story, she qualified for charity herself. She could have been a receiver of gifts, but she chose to give whatever she had because of her love for God and her joy for everything He'd done for her. There's no further mention of her in the story, but I'm going to bet you money right now she did not starve to death. She was taken care of. There's another story about another widow in the Old Testament that has a very similar theme and goes a little bit further in the details after the fact. And that's a story told in Kings, where the prophet Elijah was called to go to a small town by God. when he went there, God called this widow and said, would you take care of feeding Elijah while he's here? Well, Elijah goes and asks for a little bread. Here's what the widow replies, 1 Kings 17:12. But she said, I swear by the Lord your God that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house, and I have only a handful of flour left in the jar and a little cooking oil at the bottom of the jug. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook this last meal, and then my son and I will die. Wow, pretty heavy trip. She put it on Elijah, but Elijah told her not to worry. He'd been sent by God, and he had this message for her. And this is from 1 Kings 17, verse 14. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There will always be flour and olive oil left in your containers until the time when the Lord sends rain and the crops grow again. And the story goes on to say that, in fact, they did have enough food, and they lived for a long time on that little bit of flour and that little bit of oil. God's promise to Elijah was fulfilled, as are all his promises. God's promises we can rely on. Both widows relied on God's promise to keep them going when their own resources were nothing at all. That's what God wants for us. He wants us to share what we have with others who may have greater needs. And he wants us to do it with joy in our hearts. The widow in today's story, she did that, not being concerned with her own needs, but relying on God to meet them. Just as God met the needs of the widow in Elijah's time, and just like he'll meet our needs today if we put our faith in him. Under the laws of Moses in the Old Testament time, the tithe, or 10% of whatever you had, was the standard for giving. Now, when I say whatever you had, that's kind of what they meant. It wasn't just 10% of your income. It was 10% of your crops, of your animals, of your land, anything you had. And there were multiple layers of tithes, actually, besides just for the church. There were some for the Levites and some for other people. And one book I read said the total rate of tithing in that during that time was between 20 and 23%. That's heavy indeed, but that was accepted at that time. But when Jesus came to earth, he came to fulfill the new covenant that God made with his people, that he made with us. And that changed the focus. As just like the Ten Commandments were the big thing all through the Old Testament. But Jesus said there's two commandments that are greater than those, and he gave them to us. Love God, love your neighbor. And so the Ten Commandments were still in play, but they were less important. Same way with giving. Giving changed in the New Testament from an obligation to a joy. From a have to a can do, will do. Giving for Christ followers today has a few basic principles. Most of them were written about by Paul, and that's what I want to talk about next. First of all, our giving should be regular. Regular means at some set interval. Can be weekly, can be twice a month, can be monthly, any interval that works for you. Usually it's tied in some way to when you get your money. It's just simply easier to do it on a regular basis. Here's what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 16:2. On the first day of each week, you should put aside a portion of the money you have earned. Don't wait until I get there and then try to collect it all at once. See, that's too hard, trying to do it all at once. It's much easier if you do a little bit regularly. Remember, giving also is a form of worship, and we worship on Sunday. So giving on Sunday might be a natural way to do it. Giving under the new covenant should also be in proportion to what we have. It's pretty easy to see if we have more, we can give more. Remember the opening verse from 2 Corinthians, give according to what you have, not what you don't have. And then in the story this morning, the wealthy gave, I quote what Jesus said, from their surplus. The widow gave from her poverty. So if you give from your surplus, you probably still have a surplus left. It only makes sense, but if you give from poverty, there may be nothing left. Now, God will never ask you to impoverish yourself. That's not his way. But he also doesn't want to be an afterthought. Like, oh, yeah, I got a couple bucks left over this month. I'll drop it in the plate and give it to God. Okay, thank you. But that's not what God wants. That's not good enough. We need to do in proportion to what we have. And your proportion can be anything you want. It can be more or less than a 10% tithe. And your proportion is your proportion. It shouldn't be compared. It's not a competition with anybody else. It should be what works for you, what you're comfortable with. It should be between you and God. Might also mention here that the suggestions that I'm giving you this morning for giving are for Christ followers. If our ministries are all available to everyone, believer or non-believer, like Celebrate Recovery, worship, anything we do, Wednesday night, everything we do, youth, is available to anyone. But the financial support that makes those things possible is the gifts of followers of Jesus Christ. That doesn't mean if you're not a follower, you can't give. You certainly can. You're under no obligation or expectation to. But then, of course, under the new covenant, nobody's under an obligation to give anything. It's not required. There shouldn't be any pressure. 2 Corinthians 9:7 says this: you must decide in your heart how much to give, and don't give reluctantly or in response to pressure, for God loves a person who gives cheerfully. That's the bottom line. New covenant giving is not an obligation. It's a way to show our joy and our thanks to God for all he's done for us. Speaking of things God has done, he has done so many things in the Life Area 316 to show his love and his joy at what we do for him. The fact that we serve him in the community, in worship, as being his hands and feet everywhere we go. Our story, the story of Area 316, is a story of miracles and inexplicable God kind of things. Inexplicable at least in worldly terms, because God does God-sized things. That's what he does. We learned in the study Experiencing God, which I'm currently doing for the third time, about spiritual markers. Important events in your spiritual life that God places in your path that you can see where you've been, and you can see by knowing where you've been, where you might be going. I want to remind you of some of those spiritual markers this morning in the Life Area 316 because they're important. It's important for us to realize how much God has blessed us. And you know why he did it? Because of our faith, because we are being faithful to what he has called us to do. It reminds us again, you may have heard this before, and if you have, bear with me, but I want us all to be aware, remind us again that trusting God is the way this family works. We trust in God. Everything started when about 10 people kept meeting together, or we're 10, not about, talking about how our hearts ached for people who were too broken to come to church. How we hurt for people who were unable or unwilling or unworthy or felt unworthy to go to a church that felt like a country club. You know, Jesus didn't wear a suit. He didn't have one. And what God called us to do is to reach out to people who weren't going to regular church, who weren't comfortable there for whatever reason, And it's a God-sized job. He wanted us to plant a church with no perfect people and where people came as they were. And I don't mean clothes, I mean spiritually. Anywhere, wherever you are in your walk. That's what we were called to do. It's a God-sized job because, frankly, it's never been done before here in Caldwell. It's very rarely done in any small towns in Texas or anywhere else. The resources required aren't always available. But we trusted God to provide those resources, and God did. The original founders of Area 316 were all either players or wives of players in a group called the Mighty to Praise Band that played at a different church, played for contemporary worship at another church. 7 of those people are no longer worship here regularly. It's just myself, Hilda, and Deborah Hildebrand that are regularly worshiping here now. But the others didn't lose their heart for the people we were called to serve, because most of them are active in the ministry at Cindy's Hog Heaven just down the road. So I want you to begin to get an appreciation of how God works in the lives of those who are faithful. We met on a Sunday evening to make a decision whether we were going to be a new church or not. For the 2 days before that, Billy Gage, who was one of the founders, and myself had driven all over Caldwell looking for buildings where we could either rent or buy, where we could feel like we could start a church that would work. The only building we saw was this one, and it was off the market at that point. So we had no idea when we met on that Sunday night what we were going to do, but we knew we were called to do it. So we decided to go ahead and start. On our way home, on his way home, one of the founding group turned right when he got 36. He was supposed to go straight to go home. But something told him to turn right, and he came up here and he saw the sign, the for sale sign, in the window. Apparently it had just gone in that day. He called me and gave me the number, and I called that number the next day and was greeted with a voice that said, "This is Mohammed." Now, Mohammed is not our God, but it's a God thing to me when that's where we were sent. And the fact that it happened the day we decided to answer God's call means so much. So we bought the building. God had other things he wanted us to get to, and they weren't all, this was a good thing. They weren't all good things. For instance, we thought besides that we could get a building, and we were blessed we did, we could also get a pastor. We could just find some firebrand young pastor who had nothing better to do than be part of a new church starting in a town he'd never heard of. Nope, wasn't God's plan. God's plan, and he called me to be the original pastor, the founding pastor, to stand in the gap, if you would, until his plan was fulfilled. Well, we'll get more to that in a minute. But we opened and we had services, and what we noticed right away, we had children coming to our services, or people with children, bringing children. We had no one in our founding group who was called to children's ministry, so we had no children's ministry because we firmly believe that God will send people when they're needed. Couple 3 months later, a young lady started attending church. A single mother with 2 young children and an infant. And angel wings. She walked in the office one day after worship and said, "By the way, I used to do children's ministry at my church in Minnesota. Would it be okay if I started a children's ministry here? God provides what we need. That was our introduction to Pastor Sarah Kiros, who has been, with the exception of a little time where she took off to pursue a different ministry, she's been our children's pastor ever since. And it's one of the true blessings we have. God wasn't finished. We talked, the founding group, we talked when we were first getting started about how there was such a need in the community for a ministry or a program, any kind, for people who were fighting addictions and drugs and alcohol. One of our laments was that we didn't have anyone again in our founding group who was qualified to do that ministry. But about the same time Sarah came, within a few weeks, one way or the other, God sent Mike Stone. And we learned Mike was from Boston. We learned that he had a story. And we also learned that he had a heart for that ministry. And so our Celebrate Recovery ministry was born, which is the most important, biggest single thing I think we do. Mike was so faithful. This is all about faith. Mike was so faithful that he sat here for a year on Tuesday nights with one or two or maybe three people coming in. But he stayed the course because he knew that's what he was called to do. Today, on Tuesday and Friday nights combined, we're ministering to over 60 people. Right? That's for God. Because he saw we were faithful. And he provides people we need to do what we're called to do. Since then, we've had other additions. We've had changes in the band. I said we were all originally were musicians. Everybody but Deborah has been replaced because other people came. Chris and Eric for two main ones. I haven't lost my gig, which, frankly, I regret. But Eric's a lot better than I am. So I have no problem with that. But it just shows you how God sends people. How the band's not the same as it was. It's better than it was. But it's also people changing out and growing and moving into other things. And that's important. God saw our work. He sent people to join us here. Now, remember when I said that I was called to be the initial pastor, the founding pastor. And that's true. But it wasn't to be the forever pastor, if you will. And we tried a couple times to bring somebody in for one reason or another. They didn't always work out. So after 4 years, I was still the pastor of Area 316. Now, don't get me wrong. I love being your pastor. I would do this as long as I can, but that's not God's plan. God had another plan. And there are other things that God has asked me to do that I couldn't do and still be a full-time pastor. So Pastor Juan was introduced to Area 316. You all may not know this, but when Don McCaig was here, which was a couple years before he came, we stayed in touch, God kept working in us. He worked in Juan. And 2 years ago this month, we made a joint decision that he was going to come here and be our pastor. God's work in God's time. God provides. He's always provided. We bought the garage a year or two before Juan came, when our youth group started. Another one of God's miracles, a group of people who don't even know us gave $50,000 to complete that building so we could serve people we were called to serve. God has always provided beyond our wildest expectations. God saves the biggest surprise of all for the latest. Notice I didn't say the last, I said the latest. There's only one, have met one CEO of a major American company. Only one CEO of a major American company started his business in 1957, the year I graduated from high school. And he started that business 50 miles from where I graduated from high school. That was in Springfield, Missouri, which is where I graduated from college 4 years later. It shouldn't have been a surprise then when a real estate broker called me in October, November and said, there's somebody who wants to buy your property. When I asked who, he said, O'Reilly Auto Parts. And I had to laugh. I was blessed to meet Charlie O'Reilly because one of the things I was blessed to be able to do was make a small contribution toward a new health science center where I went to school, Missouri State University. But the guy whose name is on the building, Charlie O'Reilly. And when we went to that dedication, I got a chance to meet him, and we got a chance to talk. Now, Charlie O'Reilly does not, I guarantee you, he doesn't know that the property they just bought in Caldwell, Texas has anything to do with me. I doubt if he would even remember my name. But God did. God brought us together because he saw what we were doing. Our children's ministry had gone from 6 to 60. Celebrate Recovery had gone from 3 to 50 or 60. Wednesday night Feed the Spirit from 10 to 50. God saw we were being faithful. We were doing what we're called to do. We were just running out of space to do it. So God provided another God-sized miracle. And when that deal closed a week and a half ago, we immediately got rid of a little over $300,000 worth of debt. We also had a little money left over. And thanks to that and a generous donation, we got enough money in the bank right now, I'm pretty sure, to build that building that we're going to build next door. We'll be starting in a couple weeks. And we'll finally got the surveyor finished and the engineers working on the grading plan. And as soon as we get that, we'll be ready to go. God brings other people to us. You know, he's brought other ministries to us. He's blessed us with the opportunity to work with the African Children's Choir. He blessed us. Robert Alfaro has been doing turkey Thanksgiving for the Caldwell Motel people for years. He brought us to join Robert in that ministry. Turkey Serve Day. Scare on the Square. Serving at Crossroads Retreat. Helping volunteering. God's brought people into all kinds of ministry opportunities, and he brought Cindy Haas here to help coordinate some of that. Or all of that, really. God continues to work in the life of Area 316. And he does that because of you. He does that because each one of us, each one of you is faithful to our calling to be his hands and feet, to be his voice, to be his ambassadors, to be his disciples. That's why God does that. And that's how he shows his loyalty for our faith. God trusts us all to be good stewards of whatever we're given, whatever we have. He expects us to be faithful and obedient to his calling. And we are doing our best to do both. He's ready and willing to offer miracles, God-sized miracles that only he can provide to help us serve him. Let me share a couple of facts with you about where we stand today. As I said, we just got rid of $300,000 worth of debt. We are essentially debt-free other than our month-to-month obligations. For us to be obedient to God's calling, what he's called us to do requires about $10,000 a month. I want to put that in perspective. I was finance chairman of another church before we came here, a church of about the same average attendance on Sunday as we have. Their budget was $35,000 a month. We are doing our best to be very efficient in our use of funds. What do you get for $10,000 a month? Salaries, 2 of them. Everybody else is a volunteer. Juan and Sarah get paid. Nobody else gets paid. Utilities, cleaning, babysitters, Bible studies on Wednesday and any other time, materials for children's ministry, food for Celebrate Recovery, food for Feed the Spirit. You've never been asked to pay for any of that because we feel like God's called us to provide all that to make it easy for you, for anyone to come and take advantage of what we have to offer. But it costs money. It takes about $10,000 a month, as I said. Our current gifts run about $7,000 a month. So it doesn't take a math genius to figure out we're short about $3,000 a month. How does that work? I'll tell you how it works. We trust God to provide the difference. But God trusts each one of us to do our part. We can't rely on somebody else to do it. It's up to us to provide for the ministries that we want. And we also take 10% every month and use it for people who have needs greater than ours, special needs. If we had more than we required, we could give more. We could help more people. You don't have to worry about the use of your funds when you give it. God works in every one of us, just like he worked in the church. All these God-sized miracles. For us, we all share in the blessing. We share in the glory that God has shined on this family through all the things he's done to help us get where we are today. We reflect that glory back when we give back to him. When we say thank you, our giving is a way of saying thank you to God for all he's done for us, including giving us his only son. So ask yourself if you're doing all you can to show your joy and gratitude for everything God has done for you. Remember the verse about the cheerful giver we used a little while ago? The next verse after that, from 2 Corinthians 9:8, says, "And God will generously provide all you need Then you will always have everything you need and plenty left over to share with others. That's God's promise. And just like the promise he made to the widow, with both widows, in those two stories, he will keep those promises. He will make sure that we have everything we need. He's always done that for the church. He will do that for each one of you. He will do it for anyone who puts their faith and trust in Jesus. Let's pray.